I should have come on immediately after he left and then taken all the applause. I would ask Dr. Karen Devine will speak about, she's an expert on EU law, teaches in DCU, she lectures in DCU, and come on Karen, and she'll talk today a lot about EU law and the fisheries that Irish waters have been raped by the European Union. Karen, thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers of today's conference for this opportunity to speak on this very important question. I am a political scientist who's studied the European Union for more than 25 years, and I followed the changes in the European Union as they happened with some academic interest. And it's important to say that I teach and research the EU from a position of kind of independence and a certain level of disinterestedness in the European federalist project. And this means that I'm not what's known as a Jean Monnet lecturer, which means I'm not one of the academics who are willing to be paid by the European Commission, firstly, to promote European integration in the delivery of teaching in universities, and secondly, to act as PR agents, spreading the EU's point of view in the media and in other fora. I'm also not a politician. I'm also not a politician, although I share speaking platforms with many who are politically active from across the political spectrum. I have no political agenda to push one way or another in terms of Brexit. However, this conference is not about Brexit per se. This conference is convened to discuss what is in Ireland's interests, given the imminent departure of the UK from the European Union. So I have 3 points to make. One phrase that is often used as a health warning attached to the sale of financial products is that past performance is not an indicator of future results. When I think of examples of policies of the EU, and the three I'll talk about, fisheries, a little bit about EMU and CSDP, and the behaviours and the decisions of Irish governments in this area, that have had severe repercussions for people in Ireland and those beyond our shores, I can't help conclude that past performance is indeed a clear and straightforward predictor of future results. And it's because of this we need to talk about Irexit. So let's discuss the first of the three examples. So fisheries. As an island nation, the main natural resource of Ireland is ownership of some of the most fertile fishing grounds in the world. European Commission figures taken from the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, official database of landed catch, show that Ireland's so-called Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, of marine habitat has provided more than 40 million tonnes of fish to the EEC/EU from 1975 to 2010. To be precise, it's 43,813,716 tonnes. The landed catch is worth €67 billion in 2008's prices, and the total commercial value of that is worth twice that amount, €134 billion. So taken together, Irish fisheries have been worth more than €200 billion over that 35-year period. The Irish government knew of the wealth, goods, employment and value that could be generated from Irish seas, but bowed to EC pressure in membership negotiations and again over later years in agreeing to a common fisheries policy that yielded just 8% of that €200 billion wealth to Ireland, €17.6 billion, or an average of about 500 million out of nearly 6 billion per annum in terms of wealth. I have here, being an academic, and in fact, my talk is really kind of putting facts and figures on what Anthony Coughlin had said before. And this is the accession of Ireland to the European communities. It was laid before the Houses of the Oireachtas in 1972. And on page 47, it says, as a member of the Council, we will be in a position to ensure that our national interests in the fisheries sector will be provided for by appropriate arrangements, including the maintenance of special limits. Our small island has lost hundreds of billions as a result of a failure to adhere to that promise and will continue to in the future. And it's why we need to talk about Irexit. The second point I want to make is about treaties on EMU. The longest-serving leader of this country in the roles of Taoiseach and President, Eamon de Valera, was actually quite open to international or regional cooperation to solve collective problems, which is what the EU was supposed to be about. But he was equally determined to set appropriate limits to the spheres of cooperation to ensure national, ethical and social goals are achieved, saying, and I quote, "For certain items of the task, international action is necessary, but for the change of purpose, the deliberate shaping of economic activity to an ethical and social end is work which each can best advance in his own state. The conditions change from country to country. The problem in the highly industrialized states is very different from that in the states industrially underdeveloped." And that was to the League of Nations on the 23rd of September 1932. And his words are just as relevant today. Joining the euro currency and conceding control over exchange rates, interest rates, coupled with trade policy and financial capital controls as part of the single market, he would never have agreed to this, and no rational, right-thinking Irish government would have agreed to this. States much smaller than Ireland, states about the same size as Ireland, and states much larger than Ireland, namely Iceland, Norway, Denmark and the UK, have all maintained appropriate limits to involvement with the EU or EMU respectively, and Ireland should have followed similar paths. Although smaller states have the same trading rights as larger EU member states and European Economic Area member states like Norway within the European single market, the balance of the European single currency benefits go to German exporters. The German state bank KfW estimates the German economy would have grown by 50 to 60 billion euros less in 2009 and 2010 without the euro. Germany's aim of protecting the euro and keeping downward pressure on its value through continued membership of the EU's weaker states are riven with tension and do not justify the EU's neo-imperialist interventions, which have resulted in social, political, economic and moral crisis in Ireland, Greece, Cyprus, Spain and Portugal, to mention a few. The ECB and the European Commission pressured the Irish government firstly to accept an 85 billion loan, which it called a bailout, on the 28th of November 2010, in order to, quote from the Oireachtas, save the euro. And then at the behest of the US Treasury Secretary at the time, Timothy Geithner, who led other G7 finance ministers in a teleconference the week of the 30th of November 2010 to prevent the government from burning unsecured bondholders, which is exactly what they should have done. Once again, the Irish government As an aside, that decision was merely taken to stop extremely large American financial institutions from paying out on what's called naked credit default swaps, bets that they had made to hundreds of billions in the financial markets. But that's an aside. So once again, the Irish government failed to stand up for Ireland's legitimate interests and agreed to a morally unjust and failed to provide an economically viable solution. Governments hewn for the struggles for independence some 100 years ago would never have agreed to such policies or such so-called bailouts. The imposed EU bailout meant that Ireland's debt-GDP ratio moves from 42% in 2008 to 120% of GDP in 2012, breaking the EU's own rules on debt-GDP ratios. EU-driven austerity measures involved laying off people in the public service, pay cuts and freezes for those still employed, with new income taxes and levies on salaries and pensions, billions of euros worth of cuts in public expenditure for health services, education, welfare and infrastructure, and the privatisation and sale of state assets such as water, forestry, land and energy. Irish society has been devastated. Many people unable to receive healthcare died while on years-long waiting lists for treatment, while the Irish government savagely cut €2 billion a year from the national health budget. Young people graduating college and those with young families emigrated to find employment in Canada and Australia at a rate of 1,000 people a week, and almost 475,000 people left the country between 2008 and 2014, keeping unemployment to a peak at 15%, Now, 17.5% of Irish-born people over the age of 15 live abroad, and that is the highest proportion in the OECD. And finally, the Irish Central Statistics Office suggests that the cumulative outcome of this Irish fiscal adjustment, and in particular that 2012 budget, has been extremely regressive. According to the Survey on Income and Living Conditions, the bottom decile has seen net disposable income reduced by 25%, while the top decile income has increased by 5%. Consistent deprivation levels have also increased, so too has the percentage of those at risk of poverty. It's risen to 15.8%, or 700,000 people, of which 220,000 are children. Noticeably, the suicide rate rose to the highest levels in the history of the state, and Ireland went on to hold the highest suicide rates of youth male and youth female in the developed world. It's no wonder that a good many young people in Ireland consistently hold negative assessments of the European Union, and that young people voted no to the Lisbon Treaty in the 2008 referendum by a margin of 2-1. Finally, De Valera was also against joining an EU military alliance, which brings me to the points on PESCO. I'm not going to repeat what Professor Coughlin had said, but as you know, Ireland recently signed up to an EU military single force by the Irish government, Permanent Structured Cooperation, and a majority of Irish people, 2 in 3, are against this. So one of my other props, which I hold up here, is the memoirs of Jean Monnet, the so-called father of European integration. And in it, he refers to his impatience at governments only going so far with the European Army project as public opinion could bear. It's on page 357. And he says, "We will go ahead with our federalist project in the face of public opposition or ignorance." And that's exactly how Ireland was suckered into signing up to a mutual defence clause in the Lisbon Treaty, and how, in December past, Ireland committed to the NATO goal of spending 2% of GDP on defence, which means roughly quadrupling our current levels of expenditure from 1 billion to 4 billion euros, meaning billions less for health, training, small and medium-sized enterprise support, infrastructure projects, the list goes on. Money that could be spent on lowering the youth suicide rate, on stemming forced emigration, on providing affordable housing and childcare so that our next generation have the chance to live in their homeland. Putting in practice Monnet's anti-democratic ideals, the Irish government ran a campaign of misinformation and colluded with the EU, and in particular France, to cover up the EU's defence provisions in the Lisbon Treaty, which included the European Army in PESCO and the Mutual Defence Clause. But I looked at Eurobarometer's survey of June of 2016, and only 12% of citizens in the EU are actually aware of the Mutual Defence Clause and know what it means. And France, ironically, has the lowest level of awareness and understanding at just 6% of people, despite France being the very first EU state to trigger the Mutual Defence Clause in November 2015. Jean Monnet and his Irish adherents can be truly proud of their deceit of the people of Europe. So what of these... So to sum up, what of these 3 examples I've talked about from fisheries, EMU and PESCO demonstrated? Well, in monetary terms, if you add it all up, at the worst case scenario, and considering fisheries is worth 200 billion, but in fact, with illegal fishing, unreported fishing and discards, the value, according to some Irish naval officers and fishermen, is worth up to 2 or 3 times that amount. And you only have to look at Richard O'Donnell's amazing documentary, Atlantic, to look at the devastation that has been wrought on Irish coastal rural communities. But if you calculate all of the monies from the bailout, from PESCO, from fisheries, you're looking at a loss of, in the worst case scenario, of potentially €500 billion in today's money. These 3 examples have clearly shown the Irish government are consistently inept at, uninterested in, or simply against protecting the Irish people from a European Union that is acting against its own laws and in contradiction to its stated values of human rights, democracy and the rule of law. Given that our own government has refused and continues to refuse to do its duty for this state at the EU level, we have to look at the option of leaving in order to stop the hemorrhage of our budgets, our national resources, our living standards and our people. What about democracy, justice and equality? Well, domestically, our experience of democracy in relation to EU matters is appalling. We know of the reruns of referendums on Nice and Lisbon, and that we got no opt-outs that Denmark did on CSDP or on the euro, for example. The line from the government was it wasn't possible. Yet the same government elite were well able to put in protocols on other issues in EU treaties. And finally, what about the rule of law? The EU broke its own rules on no bailouts. The larger states of France and Germany were the first to break the convergence rules on EMU and bullied the smaller states by threatening structural funds to ensure that proper sanctions were not applied. The EU has been reluctant to acknowledge its failings, but knows well of its failings. And the final item that I'm going to hold up is a book called Ireland for Europe. And in it, the EU Campaign Group's Director of Research, Tony Brown, boasts, Ireland has never chosen to use the veto. This, to me, is the equivalent of government EU evangelism that is destroying this state. Ireland's modern-day equivalent to the fisheries in the 1970s is the corporate tax rate of 12.5%, and it's become increasingly important as employment in multinational corporations availing of that rate is roughly 200,000 or 1 in 10 jobs. By the way, as a left-wing socialist person, I don't agree with that, but anyway. I do believe that past performance is in fact a predictor of future results, as it's clear the Irish government will follow the same path of no resistance and will eventually cave under pressure. Given the failure of the EU to adhere to its own stated values, its own laws, and it's willing to promote the interests of a select elite, given our own government has failed to stand up for Ireland's interests, and given the departure of the UK and the likely departure of other states, we have no choice but to examine a number of scenarios of our future relationship with the EU, including an exit. Finally, however, I did look at EU barometer data, as I said, in June 2016, and Irish people are actually totally out of step with the EU average citizen. 14% of Irish people hold a very positive image of the EU, compared to just 3% of EU citizens. Just 1 to 2% of Greeks, Spanish, and Portuguese have a very positive image of the EU. A sizable portion of the Irish people, if they're actually aware of how poorly Ireland has been treated by the EU, I think suffer from some form of Stockholm syndrome, perhaps a legacy of the fact that we haven't truly decolonised from the British. We have replaced one imperialist coloniser with another, and half the Irish people seem to adore it. It strikes me as a reflection of the domestic context of being in an abusive relationship. The awakening of this is yet to come, hampered by the complete monopolistic silence of the Irish media. My final line. It is time to do a comprehensive study of the options for Irexit. It is not only intellectually lazy not to do so, it's patently irrational not to do so in the face of failed democracy at the EU level and the number of treasonous decisions by a self-interested governing elite. Thank you.